Good afternoon and welcome to Why It Matters, Talks on the American Past. I'm Brian Hosmer, and on behalf of the OSU Department of History and the Edmund Lowe Library, it's my pleasure to host the third of 5 events featuring History Department scholars with books appearing this year. We come to you, as always, from the Edmund Lowe Library's beautiful Angie DeBow room, which is the most appropriate venues that we can imagine for this talk. In a moment, I want to introduce tonight's speaker, and we'll get on to the meeting. But let me say a few words about the series. As you may know, historians don't just like to read books, we write them. And while our research takes many forms, we have articles, essays, museum displays, media projects, all kinds of other venues, books occupy a central place to what we do professionally, and I would argue personally. Each book represents years of combing through dusty archives, followed by the painstaking task of organizing files and presenting research in a clear and coherent manner. This series celebrates the accomplishments and work of our colleagues. We also organize these events to communicate the importance of history, why history matters to historians. So a second goal for the events draws our attention to what motivates historians to undertake this kind of work and explore certain topics. We're interested in that. Why It Matters also speaks to the many ways historians engage with our world and reminds us that understanding history informs and enriches our lives today and every day. It helps us contextualize and grapple with the present. We need that at all times, but now more than ever, I would argue. We named the series Why It Matters for a reason, as each of these books engages a contemporary topic through an exploration of the past. The series kicked off last November with a wonderful conversation with Dr. Holly Caribou on border policing, In December, Dr. Laura Arata guided us through a fascinating story of race, violence, and tourism in Montana in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. After tonight, we reconvene in March for a consideration of motivational rhetoric in the American workplaces before closing the series with an exploration of segregated worship in the early American North. Please keep an eye open for announcements. All events take place the first Thursday of each month. Before moving to the program, I want to share my deep appreciation to my colleague, Dr. Sarah Griswold, Assistant Professor in the History Department, who oversees the series and its many details. Katana Davis from our department, who's managing social media and publicity. The College of Arts and Sciences at OSU, production team at OSU Libraries, and our friends at the OSU Foundation, all of whom have contributed to this. So now to the main event. Tonight's featured author is Dr. Justin Prince, adjunct instructor in the OSU History Department. Dr. Prince earned his PhD from our department, which makes us very proud indeed, and he teaches a number of classes for us, from U.S. history surveys to upper division classes on the 2 world wars, military history, the Vietnam War, and others. His research interests focus on the American military in the late 19th century through the First World War, examining the development and professionalization of the United States Army, especially in contrast to Europe. His publications include essays and articles examining the role, training, and development of American artillery during the First World War, which of course brings us to tonight's topic. So first of all, congratulations on your first book. It's a great accomplishment and a fascinating read. And so what I'd like to do first, Justin, is begin by asking you how you became interested in this topic. Military history generally, maybe, but also this topic in particular.
So thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure. So for military history in general, it's actually kind of funny. I came to this topic, ironically enough, as a child, because both my grandfathers served in the Second World War. And my maternal grandfather in particular was very active in veterans associations. He'd been on a battleship in the Second World War. And he had all of these great stories that, for whatever reason, he never really told any of the family. He would do this, and that was kind of an isolated part of his life. And so here I was, a 7, 8, 9-year-old child, and come here, let me tell you all of these stories of World War II. So as where other kids were, learning, whatever, or interested in, current stuff, here I am learning what a kamikaze is from my grandfather. And so that kind of stuck with me. And so it just got me really interested in military history kind of in general. And then I found that no matter what I actually want to do, I always kept coming back to that. And so, getting the history degree, realizing, you got to go to graduate school, and then it's just, well, I love this stuff. Let's make a career out of it. And so how I came to this topic, it's actually funny. I was actually, at the time, I had no interest or knew anything about artillery in the Great War. I had been working on things such as, infantry weapons, looking at, the U.S. Army's adoption of rifles in the late 19th century, and through the Society of Military History, which is a fantastic organization for new and longtime military historians. There was actually a call put out for an essay collection talking about the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which features heavily in the book.
Indeed.
And it's one of the things that most Americans don't understand this. If you were to ask somebody, what was the deadliest battle in American history? You wouldn't think things like Antietam, Gettysburg, maybe something from the Second World War. But the Meuse-Argonne actually is, in terms of lives lost, with 26,277 American dead, it's the costliest multi-day battle ever fought by the United States. And so I emailed Dr. Edward Lingle, who's currently the director of programs for the National World War II Museum. And I told him, as a graduate student, here's what my research is. I would love to do an essay like this. And unfortunately, there was already somebody doing that topic. And so what I love is he suggested, well, I need somebody to do something on artillery. Why don't you take that?
Nice.
And so here I am, a young PhD student, first chance at a publishing opportunity, absolutely. And then as I began researching this and eventually write this essay, I became enamored with the topic, which then later grew into this book. And one of the great things that I learned from it, surprisingly enough, is there's actually an OSU connection to the story, believe it or not, which then at the time, Oklahoma Agricultural Mechanical College, then as many universities and colleges, numerous people would eventually serve in the First World War. Bennett Chapel, where my wife and I were actually married, was dedicated in the 1920s to those from OAMC who had died in the war.
See these in a lot of campuses around the country.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so kind of acknowledging that, Fort Sill in Lawton, which is the home of the Field Artillery School, which features heavily in the book, these guys would keep all of these old artillery pieces, using them for training, experimentation, as well as they didn't really know what to do with them. And then in 1935, they finally decided to get rid of a bunch of the weapons. And two of them found their way to OAMC. They actually said, we're giving this to the college as a Christmas gift in honor of the participation in the Great War. And so I would encourage anybody, if you're at OSU, go outside Thatcher Hall, and you're going to see two World War I era field artillery pieces. And what's, to me, fascinating is one of them, the 4.7-inch gun, is representative of the only American-made field artillery piece to actually go overseas in the First World War. I don't know if this was one that actually did, most likely not, but of the thousands of weapons the U.S. will actually, procure and produce, only 48 American-made guns go overseas, and this might be one.
We're going to get to that. I find that to be a really interesting part of the story. So the book is $1 Million Barrage, American Field Artillery in the Great War, published by Oklahoma University Press. Terrific book. I want to keep an eye peeled on that, or keep your focus on that. So that's a really great answer. I really like the combination of personal interest and local, and also the role of your advisor. I had an advisor who really directed me too. So that's really great. So this story kicks off in dramatic fashion, right at the beginning, with an infamous case of friendly fire during the Great War. The Lost Battalion, its commander, Charles Whittlesey, a carrier pigeon, all figure into this story. What's that about? And why did you choose that incident to launch this book?
So the main reason I chose that incident was kind of twofold. Is Charles Whittlesey, until about 1942, when the Gary Cooper film Sergeant York came out, Charles Whittlesey was probably the most famous American soldier from the First World War. He was somebody that everybody would have known, they would have known his story, and so I thought that was kind of a great, way to, make this case. But it's also, when you look at the scholarship of American artillery in the First World War, there's always this sense that it's problematic, that it doesn't perform, that there's failures. And so for me, take the most celebrated failure, the part where, these guys are trapped behind enemy lines. They're asking for friendly artillery. American artillery, which literally they're not observing their fire, they're not even in contact. Literally just friendly fires dropping it right on this command. And so they have to send this carrier pigeon, share me with, this note, which literally says, the artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop.
Please stop, right.
Yeah.
For heaven's sake, stop.
For heaven's sake, stop it.
Right.
And,
right.
Ironically enough, this pigeon is actually, she survived. She was wounded, she survived. She's currently stuffed and on display at the Smithsonian because we're Americans, we keep literally everything. But it's this fantastic story. It's the stuff that if you read it, you would if you didn't know, you would almost think, this was a bad Hollywood movie. That how kitschy can we be, and that in actuality, this actually happened.
It happened. So it's this amazing story that you said, as you say, was famous. Probably less so for Americans then. Generations ago, they would have known something about it. The carrier pigeons at the Smithsonian, but your point here was that this is a celebrated failure, right? This is a near catastrophe.
Yeah, that if for many people, especially after World War I, trying to figure out, at the time, the Meuse Argonne, literally this was something that people didn't know how to feel about. There's going to be congressional investigations. Why were so many Americans killed? Why did this happen?
Yeah.
And in many of those hearings, they always zero in, it's artillery. That is the one thing where we completely failed. And so for me, I wanted to kind of pull the reader in. Here's how bad it is. Now let's stop and look, what is the actual reality?
Exactly.
How do we get there? Was it really that bad? Yes, there's this issue, but look at all of the other times that... And I think part of that is because Whittlesey is so celebrated. He's going to get the Congressional Medal of Honor. He's going to be one of the original pallbearers for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier.
Right.
And then in 1921 will famously commit suicide on his way to Cuba. That again, this becomes further linked in the American mindset of, well, why did this event happen? What drove him to this?
Trauma
we need a scapegoat.
and tragedy.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. So take us back to the beginning, or just before the Great War, and what's the state of artillery training in the United States? Maybe we could ask how it's conducted, right? What are the frameworks? Did the U.S. thinking about artillery differ from other armies?
Well, part of the issue is everything's in a state of flux in the 10, 20 years before the Great War. I mean, when you look at how land combat has evolved, how land combat's changed, we're going to see the introduction of smokeless powder, the smokeless rifles, machine guns, now become the inventories of almost every army. And so part of the issue is we're trying to adjust to that reality, trying to, how can we equip our army at the same time? Stepping back and looking at a larger role, this is the United States. We're finally taking our steps on the world stage. We have overseas colonies. You have the Dreadnought Revolution in 1906. So the Navy is getting enormous sums of money. And Congress is literally, I think there's a story they're talking about, the Ordnance Department begging Congress, we need money for artillery. And a senator literally says something to the effect of, well, is it very necessary to have them on hand? Can't we just manufacture the stuff when we're in war?
Interesting.
And so it's one of those things, when you look at the U.S. Army in the run-up to the First World War, there's kind of that understanding that in our military system, we don't fully understand what is the role of a standing army, how much technology, how much weaponry does it actually need? How would this differ from any previous time in American history when cannon are relatively easy to manufacture? You can call up volunteers. And so we don't know. We haven't figured that out yet. And so when you would actually look at field artillery training, we try to look at what Europe's doing. Many of the service journals would have subscriptions to military journals from Germany, from Britain, from France. They would look at what they're doing, try to copy their methods. But it's not until 1907, when our story begins, when the United States finally says we need a field artillery school. We have to actually focus on this. And so before that, what would happen is in the United States system, there was just artillery. which meant there's the artillery used by land forces, so field artillery, and then there's coast artillery, which is what you would be using to defend harbors.
Right.
You would defend against a seaborne invasion. And what they were quickly learning is things were proceeding such that you could no longer train somebody in just this one school. You would have to start branching out. How you did cooperating with infantry was going to be completely different than if you're in, say, Charleston, South Carolina, manning a large gun waiting for a battleship to sail into view.
So these are very different operations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so 1907, the thought had been we're going to create a field artillery school, one central institution where, if not every officer, at least the majority of field artillery officers, upon commissioning could go, they could train, they could practice. And with locating that at Fort Sill in Lawton, this was a fantastic innovation that really kind of kickstarts that. For the first time, you can have the creation in 1911 of the Field Artillery Journal. You can have a professional journal just for artillery officers to be discussing what was going on. The problem is lack of money, lack of standardization, lack of manufacturing. There's actually Scientific American in an article talking about this quite literally says that field artillery officers could do everything but shoot.
Huh.
It's like the one thing that they really didn't have a chance to focus on early on.
That's interesting. So there's just all these different factors, and among them, I would imagine, is the American tradition of, demobilizing between wars, right? Cutting back, right? You mentioned the, conversation about what's the role of a standing army, and in American tradition, there was minimal role for a standing army. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so with that idea of we don't need a standing army, there's almost this conservatism of, so why do we need standing military weapons? Why do we need to keep artillery on? Why do we need large stocks of rifles? And even something as simple as rifles is something that kind of factors into the story when we get to the First World War of, quite literally, there are isolated reports of soldiers in 1918 training with weapons that had been used in the Indian Wars in the 1870s.
Yeah.
Because there's just literally that much of a shortage. And so it's kind of interesting that when you kind of look at the story, you have this for the Army, but then obviously the Navy, you need a couple of battleships, here's 3, have fun.
Well, Theodore Roosevelt loved the Navy, though.
Oh, absolutely.
So there was that, right?
Absolutely.
That was that he loved the Navy. So there's political interests as well that are in play. So I want to keep moving on this pre-war conversation because it's really fascinating and a great part of this book, I think. You do a wonderful job kind of excavating this and explaining these many, many different factors. One was really just intriguing to me, and this was the role of the Russo-Japanese War. And I think many of us who are casually, students of history, know a few things about the Russo-Japanese War, basically 3. And one is that by revealing the weakness of Tsarist Russia, it was kind of a prelude to the revolutions of 1917. So that's one, right? Nicholas II is inept, and there's one. Number 2 is it marked the emergence of Japan as a military power. So that's number 2. And number 3, Theodore Roosevelt, back to that guy, brokered the peace at Portsmouth, and this earned him the Nobel Peace Prize for brokering it. So those are 3 things I think most people know about it. I had no idea that the Russo-Japanese War was important in the story of the development of field artillery. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
So with the Russo-Japanese War, one of the things that kind of comes out of it is, in many ways, there's kind of a movement among some military historians to kind of rebrand it as World War Zero, if you can imagine that. And the reason is, if you look at the Russo-Japanese War, there's many of the factors of World War I already in place. So you mentioned the rise of Japan, which, with that, we think of the naval battles, Yellow Sea, Tsushima, where Japan has a good, modern, steel-based battleship navy. You're going to see both sides are going to use machine guns. You're going to see, in many cases, the same bolt-action rifles they would be using in World War I, trenches, barbed wire, new artillery. And so how that's going to really work with field artillery is, prior to the Russo-Japanese War, many people still believe that artillery was not that dissimilar from, say, the days of Napoleon, where you would maybe have kind of a meeting engagement. You'd bring, your infantry formations close together. Artillery would be on the gun line. You just basically fire open sights, and you just fight the battle the way you had for a century. With the Russo-Japanese War, you have longer-ranged infantry, small arms. You can't do that anymore. If you bring your field artillery pieces up, your crews are all going to get killed.
Right.
So now they have to move further back. You now have smokeless powder. You now have longer ranges. You have better propellants. You have the development of shrapnel and high explosive rounds. And then there's the fact that with trenches, now you have earthen fortifications that somehow, if your infantry are going to take that position, those have to be neutralized. And so now it's kind of looking at indirect fire, looking at, okay, how are the Russians and the Japanese, at Port Arthur or the Battle of Mukden,
Right.
how are they actually achieving that? And so you're going to have observers from Britain, France, Germany, the United States, all going kind of taking those notes. And it's interesting that as they're doing that, you can almost sometimes see their biases, whether it's, oh, well, this is Russia, they don't know what they're doing, or this is Japan, they don't know how to fight a war.
Right.
And so many of these key lessons that could have done so much for telling people how 1914 would have, happened, unfortunately just get written off to, well, these two powers, they're not great military powers.
Right.
Should we or should we not study them?
I found that to be really, really fascinating. So let me just back up one other thing too. So indirect fire.
Mm-hmm.
So, what's the skinny on that? So maybe just explain it a little bit better. You just talked about it a little bit, but I'm just curious because this is a really important distinction that you draw, or an important innovation.
Mm. So what indirect fire essentially is you fire indirectly at a target. So think of Civil War artillery. The idea being your cannon right there, you can see your target, you can directly fire at it. But now maybe you want to fire over an obstruction, you maybe want to fire over a hill, or with ranges so long you can now hide your artillery pieces, which means you can now fire over that obstruction, which means now you need to rely on, say, telephone operators or semaphore operators or radio operators to actually tell the cannon crew where their rounds are actually landing. So it might be a case of, rather than, a gunner actually being able to spot his own fall of shot, now you need someone else to do it. And so when you then have that innovation, now that means you're creating a whole new structure. You've got to train observers. You have to train people, okay, how do I know that that's coming from my battery of 4 guns, let alone which gun is actually, lobbing that shot? Then you have to have the command structure. How do you get that back to, whatever field artillery unit, and then train them, how do I make corrections on something that I can't see, but rather, here's a map, here's where I think I am, here's where I think I'm shooting, here's what he sees, and not, from above, because we don't have aerial observers yet. So here's where he thinks my shots are landing, here's what he thinks I need to do, now how do I actually make that happen?
Completely different.
Absolutely.
It's a completely different operation. That's really fascinating. That's why I wanted you to talk a little bit more about it. You're watching Why It Matters, Stories from the American Past from the Oklahoma State Library. We're with Justin Prince, Dr. Justin Prince, and we're talking about $1 Million Barrage, American Field Artillery in the Great War. I want to remind everybody that you can send questions through the chat, and they will, by some magic, make it from there to this tablet in my lap. And in fact, there is one right here, right now. And it's this. I had no idea that Fort Sill was such a critical part of U.S. preparation and weapons production. Who were the fellows doing all that work? Were they Oklahomans? Were they Texans? Or was it not that regional?
So for many of the people who would actually, military personnel working at Fort Sill, and then its associated Camp Doniphan, which would be open during the war, many of those guys would just be from whatever military unit happened to be assigned. So in many cases, whole divisions would come through and be trained. So some would be from Oklahoma, some would be from Missouri, some would be from Texas. But where the Oklahomans really would factor in is they were the ones doing many of the support jobs. So like if soldiers, in one article that I wrote talking about Harry Truman's time at Camp Doniphan, because later President Harry Truman would actually be here, he would talk, if we need to go buy supplies, we're going to go do it in town. If the soldiers need their shirts washed, it's going to be in town, that sort of thing. But this was really seen as a national establishment. And so while some people might have been from Oklahoma, in general, these would have been professional career military officers assigned from just whatever command happened to be the ones garrisoning Fort Sill at the time.
That's interesting. That sort of speaks to the way the military works and the local and the national. I also did notice in the book Harry Truman showing up here and there, so that was kind of interesting too. I'm going to talk about doctrine a little bit here, and so let's kind of move into this, and this is a nice segue from the previous question that we had. How did the U.S. Army view organized artillery? We talked a little bit about field and coastal artillery, but I'm thinking about it in the context of kind of the larger set of relationships in the Army, sort of where is artillery situated, how are they looking at this, and how is that related, if at all, to this notion of doctrinal stagnation, which is something that you write a lot about in this book?
Okay. Well, initially with artillery, like you did mention, field and coast, so the idea, what's going to basically be using naval caliber guns, and then what would actually be used for Army troops. And then within that idea of field artillery, you would actually branch that out into, maybe light field artillery, which would be like your smaller, quick-firing guns. You would have larger types of artillery. You would have siege artillery. Eventually, you're going to add things like railway artillery, where quite literally you put those seacoast guns the coast artillery would use on railroad carriages, and then you can drive them around wherever you need. So if you needed to go shell a city, now you have a weapon to do that. Where the doctrinal stagnation comes in, and there's this great line from, and it comes out of an issue of the Field Artillery Journal, where he says we're drifting along as we were before the Civil War. Because when you look at how the Army was training, what they were expecting a new war to look like, they were almost writing as like a Civil War style meeting engagement. The idea that, so let's take it as World War I. Here's the American Army, here's the German Army. They're just going to meet, fight, have their battle, retire at the end of the day. And that's obviously not what's going to happen. And so you have the Army training like that, training for a war that now in the 1910s is, the Russo-Japanese War has shown, is not going to happen.
Right, it's past.
They're training with the concept of the rifleman, meaning that they thought, one guy with his rifle was probably the best weapon the Army could ever field. So they literally thought, things like, well, effective rifle fire, that's all we need to win battles. And so you're going to see as late as, say, 1915, where, World War I is showing just how powerful the machine gun is. In the American sphere, not only do we not have a standard issue machine gun, but our field service regulations say, well, it's an emergency machine gun, or it's an emergency use weapon. We need maybe 50 per 20,000 guys, and that's all we need.
Wow.
And so it's almost a complete fantasy land of thinking that warfare is somehow going to be 19th century and not understanding just how quickly technology and mechanization have displaced that.
That's really fascinating because there's a larger story about World War I which really follows this technology and tactics and the disconnection. But what I like about your book is that it really digs down to a particular case. Is that here's what that means, right? Here's what that disconnection, that doctrinal stagnation really meant, right? And down to the nuts and bolts. So you mentioned something in your answer there, Field Artillery Journal, and this was, I think, one of your most important sources for this book. So maybe you can tell us, what the heck is that, right? What's the Field Artillery Journal?
So what the Field Artillery Journal was in, so 1907 you have Fort Sill being established. You're going to have the creation of the Field Artillery Association, which was this idea that officers of the newfound field artillery, they could get together, they could have yearly meetings, they could exchange stories, they could maybe work together. And so they had the idea, what if we published, and it starts out, it's a one every 3 months, what if we published, had a publication where each of us could, anybody in the field artillery who was an officer could submit articles, do research, maybe talk about issues that maybe they were finding in their commands, maybe some of the first articles, what was your experience of, you went to the Fort Sill course, what was your experience there? Tell the rest of us. Because when Fort Sill was established, there wasn't a chance for every officer to go there. And so what they would do is people who went there first would then publish their accounts. Here's what our training was, here's how we did, here's how many live fires we did, here's what our exercises were. And then when we really get to 1914, 1915, this was the vehicle where they could come together and talk about the Great War. Talk about, what are we seeing overseas? What are, I just went as an observer. There's a guy, I think his name is Henry J. Riley, who actually writes a book, Why Preparedness, basically advocating for the preparedness movement. In the Field Artillery Journal, he writes, here's what my experiences were from my tour in France. Or they could maybe do things like, well, hey, here's what the latest manual from France says. Here's how that contrasts with what we're doing. What changes do we need to make? Or they would even put out articles, basically saying, we need translators. We have this stack of, German material. We need to translate it.
Wow.
Is there anybody that, here that speaks German who would be willing to do this? So then, we could have this at Fort Sill and then make it available for other officers to use.
It's a fascinating set of resources, and you use them, and mine them beautifully. One of the things that was really striking to me is the kind of discordant notes in there, and there are letters that are really critical, or essays that are really critical of the school, the training, the doctrine, and I'm really interested in how those made their way into an official publication.
So I think a lot of that has to do with a guy named William J. Snow. And Snow would later be chief of field artillery in World War I. So basically he's directing everything. At one point he's going to be commandant at Fort Sill, and he's for a long time going to be the editor of the journal. And so he really wanted to have that debate. He understood it couldn't be an authoritarian system. You can't just have people, rubber stamping. You had to have that kind of debate. And so I think a lot of it were many of these guys, pre-war were kind of complaining what they needed. So this kind became a way that, all of them could commune and say, here's the shortcomings we need Congress to fix. And then especially after the war, I think, guys like Snow and later, some of these other people were just willing to tolerate that debate because especially after the war, what lessons did we learn? This is not a case where, we talked earlier about demobilization. This is not a case where we can afford to do that. We can't afford to forget what we've just learned. And so even though it was official, I love that there's this one article that it was in the 1919 issue where quite literally they were getting a little testy towards each other. And the editor said, hey, understand, we're going to take, whatever critiques, but basically keep it civil.
Right.
And so what I love, especially even with it being an official publication, especially afterward, they opened it up to people who were no longer in the military. So instead of just those regular officers, you were having guys that, maybe they had been National Guard or National Army that, had been called up, they fought, they had already demobilized. They still welcomed their critiques. Here's what my experience was. Here's what I think about what's going on.
It's really interesting. A critical part of reform is an open and candid conversation, right? I mean, I think so. That's really interesting. That it's sort of intentional in that way, and we've got to really explore this stuff. So you're watching Why It Matters: Stories of the American Past, and we're here with Dr. Justin Prince, and we're talking about this wonderful book, Dollar Barrage: American Field Artillery in the Great War. I want to remind people who are watching that you can submit questions, and we'll read them on the air, and have Dr. Prince squirm in the hot seat as you ask him really hard questions. So we want some of that. So I want to talk a little bit more about this whole debate, and this is one of the things you draw so beautifully in this book is just the conflict and the disagreement and the stagnation, and there's a lot going on, and I'm going to draw my attention to, again, maybe just for the general audience, a familiar name, and Blackjack Pershing, right? General Pershing, famous American general, World War I, and American Expeditionary Force, and before that, Mexico and the search for Pancho Villa, celebrated individual. How would you describe his approach to warfare in 1917 and then in 1918 as the Expeditionary Force is making it there? What's he make of trench warfare? And why were Americans attached to this concept of open warfare?
So for Pershing was one of these guys schooled in, kind of what I talked about, that kind of belief in rifle marksmanship. That the idea that if you had well-trained infantrymen who could shoot accurately, that's how you win battles. And so for him, I think he would famously say after the Battle of Belleau Wood, the most dangerous thing in the world is a Marine and his rifle. Referencing, the 2nd Division, which is literally one Marine, one Army brigade merged together. And so for Pershing, part of it is he didn't necessarily like artillery because it's slow, it's cumbersome, there's that supply chain. But for him, it was also looking at how the war had been fought. In the United States, there's almost disgust for how the Europeans are doing. This war had broken out in 1914, 15, 16, now it's 1917. The front lines barely moved. And for him, it was still clinging on to how we had trained, this idea of those meeting engagements, of being able to move quickly, win battles quickly. And so for Pershing, and indeed the entire command staff of the American Expeditionary Force, the thought had been that rather than trench warfare being, this is just how you fought, this is what modern warfare looks like, for them, the trench warfare was something went wrong. Somebody did something wrong. Both sides are stuck. You need to get past this. And so there was almost this kind of just continued belief in the American Expeditionary Force. Once we can make a breakthrough, then, we can get to Berlin. Then we can have, massive drives. We can move quickly. We can bring in the cavalry. And so for him, he really didn't want to make the same mistakes. You don't want to add in an army and then just start repeating the same mistakes over and over and over. The unfortunate problem with that is, as the United States was finding out, and in battles such as Belleau Wood, that tends to get people killed, unfortunately.
Right.
Belleau Wood charging into German machine guns, you're going to take horrendous American casualties. And so it's that tough bit of, we don't want to fight warfare the same way they had been, but at the same time, this isn't working. And it's actually one of the most interesting things about that is research has actually uncovered that casualty rates started going up in 1918 because as you start getting, successful advances, as, the 100 Days Offensive, when finally, the British, the French, later the Americans are able to make these breakthroughs, being in the trenches was actually saving lives because it's harder to kill somebody in a trench. And so there's that thought of, can you have open warfare against an army with modern artillery, against machine guns? What's going to be the thing that makes the difference? And of course, we're going to learn it's the tank, it's the armored vehicle. That's then what will enable you to do that. But we're not quite there yet.
But they're not there yet, right?
We're trying it, but we're not.
I found it interesting, right, that for people like Pershing, the idea was that open warfare is the natural state of warfare. And that, I guess because of the experience in the trenches, the French and the Germans regarded open warfare as a phase of warfare that would take place after, right, trench. So that's a very different way of looking at things. I thought that was really fascinating. So we have another question. Elizabeth asks, what's the most surprising thing you found in the sources?
The most surprising thing I found, I think, would have to be talking about aerial observation, which what that is as you start getting much longer range artillery pieces, as you now begin having battles where the range between the artillery and such is so great, you have to then start using airplanes to observe. For the United States, that was almost a complete failure. And so after the war, you would get these people writing articles. So one of them that would actually submit one to the Field Artillery Journal was Hap Arnold, who will later be Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Corps. Or you would have, these guys basically writing these almost scandalous books. There's one in particular that I reference quite a lot in the work. And he doesn't even try to hide his contempt. Like, he will quite literally, some of the imagery used, I'm not actually going to mention it in this video, but it's clear exactly what he thought and just that level of anger.
Yeah.
And so then when you take that, when you look, well, what's it really like? And you start to realize that I think the most surprising thing that, for me, with that is the war's going on in 1917. We're fighting throughout 1918. But there's almost this belief in the United States that maybe in 1919, 1920, that's when we're going to finally end this war. And so it's the realization that quite literally going into this, the American military is planning, this is going to be 5 years at least for a war that's already in its fourth year.
Wow. Something tough to contemplate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, really tough to contemplate. So another issue in your book is supply. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I was struck not only by seriously inadequate supplies for artillery, but also the reasons that you dig out here and why that supply really stopped us. You referenced this at the very beginning of your talk with these guns, and 2 guns here on the OSU campus. And one of them that was of the type was of a tiny number. of American-made artillery that actually went to France, right? And so we start thinking about this great battle and all this artillery, and there's no American-made stuff over there.
Yep.
Virtually none. So tell us about that.
So part of the issue was looking at the military system in the United States, which is we just flat were not prepared. We could build rifles, we could build machine guns, we can build stuff for European contracts, but then there's two main factors which are kind of limiting that. And one, obviously, number of factories. Two, you have to have ships to actually get stuff there. And the American Merchant Marine in 1917 doesn't exist in the capacity to do that. So then, and here's what's kind of interesting. I spend a lot of time talking about factories, and there's this kind of just thing that almost negates all of that, because Great Britain is literally saying, we will give you the ships to do this, but we don't want to bring over any American-made stuff. We just want bodies. We just want people. And so it's those two issues, which are going to be rectified by World War II, mean that, it's almost like what I tell students in my classes. If you look at the American soldier of World War I, he's wearing an American-made helmet, he's carrying an American-made rifle. Everything else is going to be made by Britain and France, because those are the only things. The other issue, like I can reference, the factory system just doesn't exist. When we talk about artillery, there's only 2 factories in the whole United States making artillery. For making rifles, there's only 2 government arsenals, and one had actually closed in 1916. So everything else was private industry, private factories that were making the stuff, private factories such as Winchester or Remington, which firearms makers today, they were creating factories to sell to Britain and to France. But as far as the U.S. government was concerned, there's nothing there. And so we declare war, and it's not a matter of, okay, well, hey, here's what we need. We have to build the factories. Then the factories then have to produce. Then we have to take that over. And the entire U.S. participation in the war is about 19 months. There's just not enough time. And part of it is also the scale of ammunition expended in these battles is almost mind-boggling. When you think of the British in the Battle of the Somme, we're talking quite literally, 2 million rounds of artillery ammunition. I mean, I think there's a quote I pulled from a British artillerist who made the point that the British and French both believed, here's how much ammunition we have starting the war. It will take us 6 months, to burn through all that, and by that time, the factories will be making to supply. They had gone through their entire pre-war stockpile in 6 weeks. Like what they had planned pre-war for 6 months, they had gone through in 6 weeks. Nobody understood that this is quite literally the culmination of the Industrial Revolution. This is modern industrial warfare.
So they also had disagreements about design and production of certain models. I mean, there was sort of this story of, spending a lot of money and a lot of time on a particular, artillery piece, and it essentially doesn't go anywhere. Yeah.
So there's a kind of a quote among military circles called "not invented here" syndrome, which basically, for the American military, we want to fight with our own stuff. We want to fight with stuff we've made. And so part of the issue pre-war, we could not standardize on an artillery piece. We fell in love with the light field gun, which had been all the rage in Europe in the late 1890s. The problem is, it was of such a small caliber that trench warfare, it's not really going to do much. You need bigger stuff. And we never really could produce something that was satisfactory, that, has that kind of ability of easily mass produced, that, is a good quality design, that you can make enough of. And so then the war breaks out. Then it's fact what we have is not sufficient. The French were like, here, just buy our French 75, buy the field gun model 1897. And then, so you mentioned, a lot of money spent. So there's this gun called the Crime of 1916. That's actually what Congress and field artillerists called it, because it was this artillery piece that we tried to design in about 2 months. We want to say we can take our own stuff. We will spend literal millions of dollars on it. We will make less than 50, and of the 2 that actually go to France, both of them break just from being towed. Like, they literally fall apart on the road.
Yeah. So I want to take a reminder of everybody that you are watching Why It Matters, Stories of the American Past. We're talking to Dr. Justin Prince about $1 Million Barrage. And we're getting a bunch of questions coming in, so I'm pretty happy about that. And in fact, the first one talks about $1 Million Barrage. The book is called $1 Million Barrage. Tell us about the money. How much did it cost? Was there resistance to spending the money, and who made money on these new military industries? I think you've just started getting into this a little bit.
That's actually a great segue. So how much this cost, I cannot remember the exact sum off the top of my head, but when you would look at the congressional investigations coming out of this, it turned out that the U.S. was spending millions of dollars on these pieces, millions of dollars on tooling, millions of dollars on the factories. They were letting out these contracts that were supposed to produce 20 guns a month. They might have gotten 50 in the entire war.
Wow.
And so the people that were making that, some of the private industries quite literally made bank. Some of the, those private owned industries, but a lot of it. And so here's where I'm almost going to sound not critical, is a lot of the money went to producing infrastructure that actually wasn't there. Skip 20 years ahead into the future. So now it's World War II. Why do we not hear about the same stuff in World War II? It's because those 21 factories that the Ordnance Department had to build in 1918, they're still around. They can still be used. You can still tool them up. So this was kind of a massive startup cost, but in the end, it's going to be worth it, if not in 1919. And so where the quote actually comes from, $1 Million Barrage, is the beginning of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. So it's 5 o'clock in the morning, September 26, 1918. Nearly every American field gun in the sector begins its bombardment a few hours before what's going to be the start of the deadliest American battle. And so there's so many of these soldiers would be writing home. They would then put these stories in, their official unit histories. And more than one unit would call this is the $1 Million Barrage. Because for them, there's so many guns shooting at the same amount, at the same time, so much ammunition. For them, this had to be something massively expensive. And so for them, they thought, well, if this is happening, this is going to be easy. This is going to be a cakewalk. And unfortunately, it's not. But there had been that hope that, this is now that fruition.
Just enough, a big enough barrage, enough, right, will change the course of it, right?
Right.
So $1 million barrage, that's what it means. It's really specific to that moment.
Yeah, it's literally, when we take it, it was literally that moment.
Yeah.
Though if we're going to talk about money, there's one other story I do have to mention that this might actually be one of the more surprising things that I encountered, which is obviously France wants our help. France wants the United States to declare war. They're offering to give us this artillery. Here's the guns you give me. We had to buy them from them. Like, quite literally, the French army is muted. You have all this stuff. We had to pay for every field gun we got from them. We had to pay for every horse that we got from them. And yes, they did, in fact, mark up the price. They were going to make sure that they got their money's worth out of the United States.
So there was that, and that they were doing the training too. It's a really interesting kind of relationship.
It's a monopoly,
It was a really interesting relationship part of that book. Yeah. So we've got some other questions here that I think are really great. So, one question was, why didn't the Air Forces make a greater impact?
So when you look at airplanes in World War I, understand powered flight had only been around since 1903. So what Air Forces would typically do, what their role was literally, in the case of, for the Allied powers, to basically fly over, kind of gain air superiority, and then protect planes that were supposed to spot artillery fire. Protect them as they're supposed to, be able to then report back, whether that might be, through radio, or maybe they're going to fly back and communicate that way, as well as to protect these planes that were supposed to go and take photographs of the front. So then you can kind of see, okay, how's the battle developing? Where are the enemy positions? We can then send that out to artillery. There's no real dedicated ground attack aircraft. Bombers at the time, quite literally, they would be, large bombers from maybe cities. So things like the Handley Page or the German Gotha. So quite literally, the planes just aren't there yet to be able to really influence the ground warfare. They do play a part. Absolutely, they play a part. But they're not quite there to be able to really influence it. Not like, say, in World War II.
Right. It's just the technology's not there.
Exactly.
The production's not there. I think that's really interesting. And it really relates to something that you were talking about with indirect fire and just I found fascinating the role of all of these kinds of things. So there's airplanes, geometry, calibration, meteorology. All of these things come into play. Math comes into play. I mean, all of these things come into play to really transform the way artillery is used, away from this, you see something and you shoot it, to where you need all of this other information that you've got to kind of filter together and piece together just to place, right, the barrage where you want it to go.
Yep.
And it's really fascinating. It's multifaceted.
Well, and it's absolutely insane when you then consider how quickly people had to learn how to do this. So, just mentioned taking those photos. And so ideally what they would do is send those to each individual battery. Here's the photos, here's where the guys are. Then the thought was, well, we can fire by the map. So then we can kind of use math, figure, okay, if I'm here, target's here, here's the weird fantasy numbers that I'm a historian, that means I can't do math. So,
right.
And if you, but then they go, okay, well, calibration fire. We know exactly how this piece fires. So we know exactly how to get this to do what we want. Then meteorology, we have to know not just, which way the wind's blowing. We have to know how cold it is, not just for the artillery piece, but then, okay, based on that range, here's how high that shell's going to go. And so this is where the air service was actually doing stuff. We have to be able to know at each band of altitude what's the air pressure, what's the temperature, how is that going to impact it. So then you can then distill that into math to then, okay, here's where you need to shoot to get on target.
That's why you need an artillery school.
Quite literally. There's just literally
kidding, right?
so much
There's a
stuff.
lot. I found that really, really tremendous. So here's another couple of questions from the folks tuning in. What was the process like with turning your dissertation into a book? So a really different kind of question.
So in this case, the one part I won't suggest is sitting on it for a few years. I would definitely suggest, start, kind of immediately. The first thing that I would give anybody, suggestion I give anybody writing a dissertation is perfect is the enemy of good. Write it, get it done, clean it up after. Don't fall in that trap of it's not good enough, it's not good enough. For me, when I picked it up again a few years after it was my dissertation, I thought about, kind of looking at it with fresh eyes. What do I want to add to this? What are things that I didn't get to talk about? And so I spent about half a year taking care of that. I then submitted it to OU Press, where I worked with a really great editor, Adam Kane, who's now with the U.S. Naval Institute Press. And then what he did is he's like, okay, well, he read a chapter, I like it, let me see the whole manuscript, this is good. He then sent it out to reviewers whose their comments are on the back of the book. And when they, responded glowingly to the book, then they said, okay, now you can do the manuscript, now we'll do this. We're going to give you this much time. Here's kind of when we want it back. And they were fantastic to work with because this happened, unfortunately, right as my wife was recovering from a stroke. And so there was that kind of realization, I'm not going to be able to get this back in time. And so they were able to work with me. We set a deadline. I then spent a majority of the year revising the manuscript, kind of filling in arguments, things like that. And then I worked with a great editorial staff. We edited it, realized that, as one reviewer said, I needed a copy editor incredibly bad, and I will own that. and then from that moment, the wonderful staff at OU Press kind of took, they kind of did everything behind the scenes.
Great.
And so it's definitely more, it seems intimidating, but I would urge anybody new PhD, it's really not that bad. It seems far worse than it actually is.
I think some of it for moving from a dissertation to a book is cutting things out. And things that you really thought were interesting, and you realize that they may distract from the central argument that you're trying to make. So this is a perfectly interesting story over here. However, it's not really the story I'm trying to tell. And so I think that's really good advice. So I got a couple more. We've got a little less than 10 minutes in Why It Matters, Stories from the American Past with Dr. Justin Prince, and we're talking about field artillery in World War I and moving through all kinds of interesting parts of this. And so please, if you have a question, now's the time to submit it. So I have a question here, again, taking a little bit of a different direction. And how accurate was the movie 1917 based on your research in terms of weaponry and tactics?
So if we're going to look at things like weaponry and tactics, I think it actually did a fantastic job. Would really you be sending just a couple of guys as runners to go dispatch messages? They would have used runners, absolutely, but would officers have called off assaults? Most likely not. I mean, and so there are some issues you could, kind of take exception with, but in general, remembering back to the movie, it's actually been a little bit. I think the most inaccurate parts that I can recall was the part where the German aircraft comes in and basically strafes two guys. That's not going to happen. And then there's a scene where in the British lorry, when you see these guys being moved behind the front, you actually see Indian troops, which I thought was a fantastic addition. But you would not have seen Indian troops with normal British regiments. They would have been isolated in their own regiments, so it would have been an entirely different command structure.
I see.
But aside from that, I thought the movie did for what I saw it opening night. I loved it.
It was
So
a really powerful movie, I thought.
it absolutely is,
Yeah.
and I think if nothing else, it really gets to the horror I think World War I would have conveyed. I mean, this is literally a world where everything is out to kill you.
Everything.
Death is, always right there. I mean, just how terrifying it must have been. I think the movie does a fantastic job with that.
Yeah, I think so too. So we're nearing the end here, and one of the questions that we really like to pose in this book series comes back to the title, Why It Matters. And so this is a fascinating story about military history, artillery in World War I. But can you step back a little bit and tell us a little bit about the sort of broader significance? How does this speak to any number of things that you might, whatever you choose, but how does this speak to a broader sweep of time or topics or things like that?
Well, one of the things that, I'm not gonna lie, it never occurred to me at the time when I was writing this story. And then Stephen Lukasik, who was one of the reviewers, he's from, I want to say, one of the service staff colleges, made the point that I needed to expand on this, was I think it's, ever since the Cold War, we kind of have this idea of fear the military-industrial complex. We kind of look at how costly military stuff is. We look at things like new F-35s that cost millions of dollars and one Abrams tanks that are extinguished. There's this idea, do we have to spend so much money on military spending? But then I think what my book tries to do is kind of say, maybe we shouldn't spend that much, but don't spend too little, because here's what happens. You then get a service that is not fully trained, that doesn't fully know what to do, that has to beg, borrow, and steal, which means quite literally we have to work with allies, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But how many people died because of that? How many people died because, we were not good to go on day one? How many people, because of insufficient training? There's numerous accounts we have in there of friendly fire, of artillery dropping rounds short, killing Americans advancing. And so I think why it matters would be not only looking at why military spending is important, but also looking at things like training, or looking at Congress when it wants to cut back money. Maybe that kind of tale of why does Congress support some military programs, even bad ones,
and not others,
and not things that maybe cost less and are better. And then, I think like one of the comments said, follow the money. Who's getting the money? Who's getting those contracts? Why then are we choosing, let's spend millions of dollars on battleships, but yet for land fighting, they get nothing. And so I think that's what keeps the story relevant, is
absolutely.
What does that say then about how necessary military spending is even today?
Yeah, and I thought if I could interject my own sense of this too, that at the end of the book, I really got a better feel for that. And we mentioned it a little while ago, but it was the importance of really frank, candid, painful assessment of the circumstance. I think was really important, again, in the Field Artillery Journal. When some of these highly critical pieces come out, you realize that's essential, absolutely essential. Absent people being willing to speak the truth, the reforms would have been stalled or would not have happened as quickly. And they were willing to say, and the publisher was willing to put that in and say, these are difficult conversations that must take place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was actually one of the reasons why I wanted to center on the Field Artillery Journal. Was it's one thing if you find that in an archive, here's somebody's private letters to somebody, but here this is something people read it. Young new officers are reading this. This is influencing them, and I think quite literally, I mentioned William Snow earlier in the talk. they're going to serialize his biography in 1941, publishing in that journal, saying, okay, there's another war brewing in Europe. We need to learn the lessons of the last war. We need to have those conversations once again.
Unlike what happened with the Russo-Japanese War when they didn't learn.
Exactly.
They just said this is irrelevant to us.
Yeah,
right?
This doesn't matter. We're not going to pay
matter.
attention. 10 years later, oh, never mind.
Never mind, right?
Right, exactly.
Well, I think that's a great way to end this talk, and it was just wonderful listening to you talk about this book, and your passion and interest for this topic just pours through. And I want to thank everybody who watched, and thank also my wonderful team here. I call you my team. They're really not. I mean, they're the team who I rely upon. And I also want to remind everybody that the next talk takes place 1 month from today, and we're going to be speaking with David Gray. And the name of the book is Live Better, Motivation, Labor, and Management Ideology. And so it is Work Better, Live Better, excuse me, I misspoke. And it's a really great book about motivational philosophy in the American workplace in the middle part of the 20th century. So it really takes us kind of in an interesting direction. I think may speak a lot to the way we think about the workplace today. Mm-hmm. So with that, thank you again, Dr. Justin Prince. I really appreciate it. I want to remind everybody, this is a great book, not only for military historians, just kind of everybody. It's a wonderful read, beautifully written, and a compelling story. And thank you all, and we'll see you 1 month from today.